Shirley Ho won't make it. That's why we start at 10 a.m. And this afternoon, we also had the cancellation of Debbie Marks. So we start at 3 p.m. instead of 2:30. And we have two great speakers today. And to follow the theme of yesterday, we have actually people from physics and chemistry today to really dovetail what we talk about, high-level philosophical angle of interpretability. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Michele Ceriotti from EPFL. He's a professor of computational science and modeling, and he has been using machine learning to study molecular dynamics and statistical mechanics of materials. So Michele, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pity that I can't be there in person, but I'm here at least virtually. So I'm going to focus my talk on interpretability in machine learning of matter in the context of atomic scale modeling. So before I start, I want to make sure that I show you at least once the faces of the people who did all of the work that I'm going to tell you about. And then before I start getting into examples of how you can try to get interpretability in the use of machine learning in this context, I also want to give a little bit of context in terms of what we are trying to achieve with machine learning in this field. So broadly speaking, my field is quite similar to that of David Limmer, who will speak afterwards. And broadly speaking, my objective is to achieve predictive modeling of the behavior of matter, starting from atomistic scale and from fundamental equations of physics. So essentially, if you want to study the behavior of real, so to speak, materials, there are two axes that you need to consider in terms of the accuracy of your simulation. And one is the accuracy by which you describe the electronic structure of your system and all the properties that you can compute by solving the electronic structure problem. So most notably, the interatomic energy within a Born-Oppenheimer approximation can be obtained by solving some approximations of the electronic structure problem. The more accurate, the more expensive in terms of computation. And the other axis involves sampling thermal fluctuations, disorder, quantum mechanical fluctuations of the atoms themselves, essentially of the nuclear degrees of freedom. And this is an additional axis over which you can apply different levels of accuracy. You can go from a static picture in which you associate, for instance, a crystal with the ideal perfect structure, to a high level of statistical sampling accuracy in which you would incorporate anharmonic fluctuations, quantum fluctuations, disorder, and defects, and so on and so forth. So along both of these axes, a lot of progress has been made over the past 20 years to basically erode the obstacles that limit, getting to the full-blown accurate treatment. But what is really still very, very complicated is being able to really discover emergent physics, let's say, phase transitions and so on and so forth, without making any approximation along the way. And I think that, at least the way I use machine learning, the main objective is really to get around this enormous computational bottleneck and basically sidestep the calculation of the electronic structure and get for instance, the interatomic potential through a surrogate model. So basically you train the model on a certain number of reference configurations and then be able to predict it over and over again so that you can sample phase transitions and emergent phenomena without having to worry about solving over and over again the electronic structure problem. Something I will not have much time to discuss, but something that we work a lot on is the fact that, one of the advantages of solving the electronic structure problem is that you get a lot out of, a self-consistent solution. And typically you can get all sorts of other observables, dipole moments, NMR chemical shieldings, charge density, Hamiltonians, you name it. So from the sort of a big picture point of view, what we're trying to achieve is to get atomic structures and feed them to different types of machine learning algorithms, going basically from regression to do inference, which is basically what I was talking about, but also, and I will show a couple of examples to sort of interpret the outcome of an atomistic simulation that gives you an incredible level of detail, but is, you know, sometimes it's too much detail, and in order to really understand what's going on, even from the point of view of a physics-based simulation, you need to apply some kind of automatic data reduction technique to extract the essential elements out of a simulation in which you have 100,000 of atoms doing their thing. So an essential ingredient in all of these is the representation that you use to basically map the Cartesian coordinate of the atoms into a form that is mathematically more suitable to perform all of the more or less classic machine learning tasks that you want to achieve. And actually, this would be the first part of my presentation today, will be about this problem of representation and how to sort of get structural representations that are, to an extent, intuitively understandable, at least to a physicist. So one of the reasons to try and make a representation interpretable and physically inspired is that in the process you can inject into your model at the very origin a lot of fundamental physical constraints. For instance, one obvious constraint that is very useful to embed into the representation is to have basic continuous symmetries built in. So, you know, the fact that the properties of a molecule don't depend on the absolute position in space, that scalars don't depend on rotations, and that also don't depend on the order by which you label the atoms. All of these are fundamental physical symmetries. You are not really building in some very system-specific insight. It's very generic, but very useful because you basically simplify, you basically avoid seeing structures that are distinct, that are the same structure as distinct. And at the same time, and this is another difficult issue, is that you want to achieve this symmetrization without losing the the objective of having a complete description of structural space. There are other fundamental physical requirements, such as the smoothness of the mapping, that is very useful to incorporate, and something which is extremely useful from the point of view of chemistry, and both the level of the efficiency of the model and its interpretability, is to use representations that have an additive structure. So an additive structure is something which is really built into basic thermodynamics. You have an additive property, extensive property. In the thermodynamic limit, the property of a macroscopic system can be broken down into contributions from its parts. And many traditional physical models postulate that you can do this, that you can basically decompose something like the energy of a crystal as a sum of contributions associated with each of its atoms. Now, this physical assumption has a consequence from the point of view of the mathematical form of the representation that you use. So, for instance, if you use feature vectors to describe your structure, if you want them to reflect this additive decomposition, the vector that you associate with a crystal should be written as a sum of vectors that describe atomic environments. And the same is true if you use kernels, and in many ways, the same is true also if you use nonlinear models. So essentially, this locality, from a fundamental point of view, incorporates a notion of nearsightedness, something which is built very deeply into the the ethos almost of chemistry and condensed matter physics, but also from a practical point of view, it's very useful because it makes your models transferable. You know you learn the behavior of the pieces of your materials, and then you can use training on relatively simple systems to make predictions into larger and more complicated structures into which some unexpected emergent physical phenomena may arise. And I should also say that the centrality of representations into this exercise of doing machine learning for chemistry and physics is, I mean, perhaps a little bit of a circular argument, but it's perhaps also made apparent by the number of different families of representations that have been proposed over the past 10 or 15 years. And actually, one of the things that we have been working on over the past 3 or 4 years is essentially trying to put some order into this jungle and this zoo of alternative frameworks. And what we have realized is that actually the vast majority of these descriptors can be expressed as a projection on a suitable basis of relatively abstract objects that can be understood as symmetrized correlations of the neighbor density. So, you know, for all of you with a background in statistical physics, basically we describe individual structures in terms of the pair correlation function, the three-body correlation function, and so on and so forth. And this hierarchy allows you to achieve a complete description of a structure while incorporating all of the basic symmetries. So we have been really working a lot on this, and we have been, you know, showing how not only you can build fully symmetric descriptors that are suitable to treat scalar properties, but you can also build equivariant descriptors that you can use to learn tensors. You can actually generalize this framework to also, you know, the main limitation to the nearsightedness principle is basically non-screened electrostatic interactions. And we have also found a way to incorporate this kind of long-range physical correlations into a semi-local descriptor that is very efficient if you want to learn about long-range delocalized physics. And those of you who are perhaps a little bit more familiar with modern developments in machine learning for chemistry might have heard a lot about equivariant machine learning frameworks. And actually, you can show that even these equivariant frameworks that on the surface are usually discussed in the language of neural networks can actually be mapped almost one-to-one with the generalization of these correlations, in which basically you put you look at correlations between densities centered on different atoms. And by doing this, that's how you incorporate an element of, you know, message passing structure into the descriptors. Now, again, this is mostly for those of you who have a little bit of familiarity with equivariant machine learning frameworks. The way you implement these things in practice and the way you can show the link with equivariant machine learning for chemistry is basically by picking a smart basis to expand your neighbor density. And a smart basis, since we want to enforce symmetries, is a basis that is adapted to the O3 group, basically a basis of radial functions and spherical harmonics. And if you do that, basically you can show that the coefficients of the density act themselves as equivariant descriptors. And you can then, and this is something again that will make the physicists in the audience very happy, you can basically build higher order correlations of the atom density by applying an angular momentum sum rule to lower body order representations. And so basically this gives you a hierarchy of equivariant descriptors that transform like angular momenta, and you can use to expand any tensorial property. So here basically the level of interpretation was at the level of incorporating physical principles into the model. But now I also want to discuss a little bit how you can interpret the functioning of a model. And one way of interpreting the functioning of a model is basically to start by recognizing that we're using as features these, for instance, you know, one of the entries in this hierarchy is a nu equal 2 correlation, basically a 2 neighbor, what you would call a 3-body correlation of the atom density. This is equivalent to evaluating the density at 2 points, and then averaging over rotations so that you obtain an object that describes 3 body correlations and is invariant to the absolute orientation of your molecules. So if you do that, what you obtain is basically something which is equivalent to evaluating a single density in 2 points. And so you see that this kind of form is very redundant, and actually these descriptors only depend on 2 distances and 1 angle. And actually, if you take the sharp density limit of this descriptor, what you can recognize that actually these descriptors correspond to a sum over 2 neighbors of delta functions that basically track the distance and the angle between pairs of neighbors. And then what you can recognize is that if you build a linear regression model using these descriptors, a linear regression model is basically, this is a little bit of a more general formulation, but basically this is a linear combination of weights that describe a potential, for instance, with this descriptor that describe the structure. And since we are basically describing the structure with a sum of deltas, this is basically a potential that depends on 2 distances and 1 angle. So again, this is a very familiar form for expanding a potential, and arises naturally from the use of these representations. So in a certain sense, physics-based models are really very closely related to the models that we build on these type of descriptors. Now, another aspect in which you can introspect your model to try and extract some interpretation and some understanding about the underlying physics is trying to characterize a little bit better the locality of your model. So all of these descriptors are based on these atom-centered correlations, and usually to compute them in practice, you decide a cutoff up to which you perform your expansion. And then you can vary the cutoff and check how accurate your model is. So here you can see learning curves. Here I'm trying to learn the atomization energy of some small organic molecules. And I'm trying to do this learning exercise and building learning curves as a function of the cutoff radius that I'm using. And what you can see here is that actually, if you have a small amount of training data, a very short range cutoff of just 2 angstrom actually gives the best performing model. And the reason is that essentially the covalent bond is short ranged. And so it's pointless to, if you have a small amount of data, it's pointless to distract your model to learn long range correlations. It's better to get it focused on this short range information that contains a lot of the information on the stability of a molecule. And then if you have more data, you can basically increase the cutoff distance, and then you avoid the saturation of the model. And I mean, this is a horribly hand-wavy procedure, but I think that you can read into the envelope of these learning curves an indication of the amount of energy information that is available within a certain cutoff from a central atom. And actually, I mean, this is perhaps, how this interpretability helps you also build better models. At this point, you can also recognize that interactions between atoms and molecules are multi-scale in nature, and then you can build a model that is multi-scale in nature, weighting descriptors built on different length scales and achieving a model that is more accurate for each size of the data set, because it basically reflects the natural length scales of the different interactions. Another example of how you can recover some traditional physical insights, or here probably more appropriately chemical insights, is basically by looking at how you can learn the behavior of different atoms. So something I didn't tell you is that these atom density descriptors are basically stratified depending on the nature of the different atoms. Very much like you would define partial correlation functions in a scattering experiment. Similarly here, we compute a separate channel for the density of oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen. And then you can ask yourself, okay, but what if I have 50 elements? Then I need to learn the behavior of 50 independent channels. This is a nightmare from the point of view of data efficiency and also from the point of view of memory requirements. So actually what you can do very, very hand-wavingly is to use a classical elements picture in which you say, well, actually there is only a small number of elements that matter, and they can describe all of the actual chemical elements as a combination of these small number of, let's call them alchemical archetypes, okay? And then you can build a model in which you learn simultaneously the composition of the actual chemical elements in terms of these abstract elements and the target property, in this case, the cohesive energy of some crystals. And then what is very nice is that if you, now if you take, just 2 elements, basically each actual chemical element is a vector in 2 dimensions. And you can plot these vectors in 2 dimensions. And what I find very reassuring is that the best alchemical composition is one that clusters together elements that belong to the same column in the periodic table. So in a certain sense, we rediscover the periodic table by a data-driven procedure. So the last bit that I wanted to discuss is something a little bit different, and has more to do with unsupervised learning. So as I mentioned, you run large, complicated simulations. For example, you can enumerate all the conformers of some small molecules. And then in this paper, Mariana Rossi, the EPI, was trying to understand how adsorption of this molecule on a surface would modify the conformation landscape. And so here, each point, each of the gray points correspond to a conformer in the gas phase, and you can see that basically interaction with surfaces with very little changes between the different noble metals basically restricts the number of available conformers and modulates their stability. And if you use a protonated, so basically a charged molecule, the landscape change a little bit more. So you can use this also, for instance, to classify different types of polymorphs of a molecular crystal. This is a big problem for the pharmaceutical industries. And this is, here you can get some understanding of what is the relationship between packing and stability. And actually, we have been trying to make, so usually we used to do these things by doing something like a principal component analysis of a kernel PCA or a note encoder. So basically just trying to look to recurring patterns in the structure of the materials. But lately, we have started also incorporating information on the target. So basically trying to build maps that simultaneously differentiate between structures that are configurationally diverse and also can give a good linear prediction of an interesting property. And by doing this, you actually get much better and much more insightful classification, for instance, of the different polymorphs of carbon. So this is a data set constructed with a random search, and so you also get pretty absurd simple cubic carbon, and you see how it's separated out much, much more nicely. We're also using, again, for molecular crystals to try and understand what makes a molecular crystal stable. And here we are really basically combining many different types of machine learning techniques to try and provide tools to interpret large data sets, recognizing more efficiently the kind of design principles that people have been fishing for by manually inspecting large databases. Something very quickly I wanted to discuss is something that we call knockout machine learning models. I think that in the computer science community, these are called ablation studies. And here, basically, the idea is that if you have a descriptor that is interpretable, you can actually use you can manipulate this descriptor to understand something about the physics of your system. So for instance, you can switch, you can again change the cutoff distance, remove angular information and use only pair correlations. And you can see how these experiments change the ultimate accuracy of your model. And by doing this, you can understand which structural features are key to determine the properties of your material or your molecules. And you're using these also, for instance, to characterize the synthesizability of different materials. Now, basically, since we have less than 5 minutes left, I would quickly wrap up so that we have perhaps time for 1 or 2 questions. And basically, I would say that from my perspective, in terms of the application of machine learning to atomistic modeling, there is a very clear and widely recognized into the community appreciation of the fact that the divide between data-driven and physics-based approaches is not so sharp and is not so impermeable. So there is a lot of mixtures, a lot of cross-contamination, which is being very, very effective in advancing the field, both from the point of view of the accuracy of the models and also from the point of view of how much we understand about the physics, not only about the model, but about the physics that we are trying to describe. And something which I think is an interesting question, particularly, interacting with scientists from other disciplines, is up to which point physics-based priors are useful. What makes them very useful in my field is the fact that usually you don't have unlimited amounts of data. And so basically being data efficient is quite a significant added value. And I think that actually the concept of interpretability, I have a little bit of mixed feelings about it, because contrary to the idea of using physics-based priors, what interpretability means depends a lot on kind of a subjective viewpoint on what is interpretable by the human mind. And so I think it's very interesting to see what we gain by trying to enforce interpretability and what we lose. So this is my last slide. So thank you for your attention. And if we have 1 question, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you. Do we have 1 quick question? Do we have 1 quick question?
I have one, Ben.
Yes, Jack.
You can ask him if you can't hear me. It's okay. You can just repeat it. Ben, you just repeat it.
Okay.
It seemed like most of that was a great talk, but it seemed
Thank
like
you.
The approach was very heavily focused on kind of classical regression, kind of started up and modernized. And the unsupervised learning deep network approach was not so heavy on it. Long question repeat. That was a great talk. It seemed like a lot of the methods that you're using are modern updates of classical regression-based approaches, which I think is great. And it seemed like the unsupervised learning deep network stuff that any student under the age of 25 is very excited about was less focused. How do you think those 2 things go together?
So there are 2 aspects. So one is the fact that if you want to incorporate symmetries, and we have a recent paper about this. So if you want to incorporate symmetries into your models, these really, symmetry ties your hands. So the only way you can build nonlinear combinations of irreducible representations of SO3 so that they are still irreducible representations of SO3 is basically by doing a Clebsch-Gordon product. So if you actually look at the equivariant machine learning models that are currently, what the cool kids under 25 are excited about, they are basically doing this. So you are just stacking several of these CG products. And so there isn't really much fundamental difference between building these features and then using them in a linear regression framework and using something like tensor field networks. they are doing pretty much the same thing. So there is this aspect. And then the other aspect that I mentioned is the fact that usually deep models are very data hungry. And if you need to learn energies that are computed, with quantum Monte Carlo or with couple clusters, you can afford a few thousand structures. You can throw a lot of CPU time and get a few 100,000, but you can't get 10 billion. So that is another aspect which I think gives, at least for the moment, a competitive edge to relatively simple models. But things will probably change, even just sociologically,
Thank you. So we have a whole hour. Thank you. So we have a whole hour, but right now I have another break. I think one first break at 10:30. And then we'll come back at 11 and have a whole full hour to continue this discussion. So see you guys in half an hour. And come back in half an hour. Thank you very much again.